Hello and welcome to this CNBC Africa special broadcast of the Murtala Muhammed Foundation 2013 Public Policy Dialogue. Now, the theme for this year's event is Invested in Africa's Future, Unlocking the Potential of Our Next Generation of Leaders. Now, for the next 45 minutes, we'll be focusing on the topic, Developing a Sustainable Strategic Framework for Leadership Education. We're going to have 45 minutes of that, and then we'll have a 15-minute question and answer session where the audience will get a chance to ask questions and, of course, relate to our panelists. But first, let me introduce to you the panel discussants who will be talking about this topic. To my immediate right, I have Fred Swanica. He's passionate about Africa and believes that the missing ingredient on the continent is good leadership. Well, he has founded 2 organizations that aim to catalyze a new generation of ethical, entrepreneurial African leaders, African Leadership Academy and the African Leadership Network. Next on the panel, I also have Professor Ebere Onwudewe. He's a distinguished fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development in Abuja. Professor Onwudewe was a senior faculty member in the Department of Behavioral Sciences at the Center State University in Wilberforce, Ohio, USA, where he was the director of the National Resource Center for African Studies and later Executive Director of the Center for International Studies. Also on the panel is Professor Ram Kumar Kakani. He's a visiting professor at the Pan-Atlantic University here in Lagos. Well, he comes to Nigeria from Lai Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration, where he is a professor of public administration. Also gracing the panel with us today is Folashade Adefisayo. She is a former executive director and chief executive of the Corona Schools Trust Council, a not-for-profit organization involved in the management of schools. Folashade is a former banker with over 16 years commercial and merchant banking experience. She also managed the finance function of a multinational company for over 5 years. Thank you all for being here, for being on this panel. So I think a good place to start would be going back in history, as it were. Now, post-colonial Africa, we've seen war, we've seen conflict, we've seen poverty at unprecedented levels. And I remember growing up during my secondary school days, looking and watching television, I saw all of this. And I remember I kept asking myself then, why do we have these kind of leaders? We looked to the West, and it just seemed that the leaders there had the interest of the citizens, at heart. But here in Africa, although it's a different story now, thank God, but that has been largely what we've seen. So where did we get it wrong?
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to start to answer the question beginning from this moment in our country back to the colonial period. I think that to reflect on what the problem of leadership that produces the ills that you describe, we have to look at what constitutes the key issue of our time. And I think that in our country, for example, that key issue is that of conspicuous consumption, the concentration on consumption rather than production. I think that it has created an atmosphere of civic cynicism, the easy money that we have from those very close to power and circulating that money in very indiscriminate, conspicuous way, that it puts into question the value system of the country. I think that this particular problem, they cannot be traced to the leadership of the colonial period. Concentration was to lead us to independence and to create a strong nation that will be contended with by other nations, a strong competitive nation. And the business they did was create competition among the constituent units of the country. That competition is now dying down. The emphasis on merit is now dying down. What we have is easy money circulating everywhere and creating an atmosphere of distrust and violence. I think that this conspicuous consumption has to be dealt with by setting examples, especially by those who are now in power. I think that what we call corruption emanates from this value system that has been degraded through this consumption pattern. I think that what we have is a situation of civic cynicism. Civic cynicism refers to a situation whereby a Nigerian believes that he cannot do well in Nigeria if he becomes compliant to due process. He cannot do well if he's behaving in a principled and following due process format. Since this is the mindset of many Nigerians, of a whole lot of us, we can find now that it is the issue that is behind the rot which has created growth without development, the rot which has created a situation where people don't believe in wealth creation, but simply believe in consumption.
Folashade, perhaps Professor paints a very bleak picture. Do you agree with him?
Well, to some extent, because he's right. I mean, there's a lot of public conspicuous consumption around. But I would look at it and say that I'm trying to look at the practical side of it. Okay, so that fact exists. So how do we get out of that? That's really my own, that's the way my mind is going. And I think that I would like to look at practical ways by which we address this situation. It's there. I mean, there's no need to gloss over this situation, but I'm looking at our educational system and how that system can support change going forward. And I think that's really why, we said unlocking the potential of the next generation of leaders. I think I learned this from someone, that these students who are sitting here, they are not the leaders of tomorrow. I think they should start being leaders now, today. And how do we get our students to be leaders? I'm not saying lead the country, lead themselves, lead their schools, lead the societies in their schools, be leaders within their home. So I think, for me, I would like to look at this, the other side and say, how can we get this generation right now? How do we get them to...
Let me come here. I understand, yes, definitely we're going to go into that point, but like I said, growing up in secondary school, seeing all of that happening, I had that question in my mind, and now, assuming that, students here too perhaps had that question in their mind where we got it wrong, so I was thinking, let's set that as a foundation, let's look back, see where we went wrong, why we have the kind of leaders that we have today, and then we can begin to go forward.
I look at values, the way we were brought up. Things have changed utterly. I think our role models have changed. We are no longer looking at political leaders and so on. Anyway, we can't really look at them, frankly speaking, because too many of them are involved in what Prof has tried not to call corruption, but which is really corruption. So I think we've really got it wrong that way. And our youth are looking and seeing all this. And therefore, for them, it all looks bleak and hopeless. And we are repeating that cycle over and over again. So I agree, it starts from this concept of conspicuous consumption. It also goes all the way to what we are teaching, what we are role modeling, the values they are building into the next generation, and just the fact that, do they even see any hope for themselves? How do they see themselves as Nigerians? When you talk to a young Nigerian child, invariably he or she is thinking about how to leave Nigeria because there's a hopelessness to it all.
Just your thoughts on going back down a memory lane.
In my mind, where I'll take more of a, not just a Nigerian perspective, but an African perspective, because the experience that we've seen in Nigeria is not unique to Nigeria. Throughout Africa, over the last 50 years, the leaders that we had, I don't think have lived up to the expectations that were set, that we had at independence. And one reason I believe is that they were not, one thing to bear in mind is that most nations in Africa are young. So, we beat ourselves up for saying, we've had bad leaders for the last 50 years and so forth, but we also must realize that nation building takes generations. And, if you look at the US and Europe, so those societies were built over 300 to 400 years. And so most nations in Africa are, in the very early stages of their formation. And at independence, they found themselves, thrown together, different ethnic groups and so forth, and we had to then work our way through all those challenges to actually begin to form states that can be governed properly. So a lot of that process is what has been taking place. But another issue is that those who found themselves leading the countries at independence had not been prepared adequately for the roles that were suddenly thrust upon them. I've seen statistics that show that at independence in 1957, when Ghana, which is where I'm from, when we got independence, there was something like between 18,000 and 22,000 university graduates in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, if you exclude South Africa. Of those 18,000 university graduates, 16,000 came from two countries, Ghana and Nigeria. So, you know, the Congo found themselves with 18 university graduates at independence, and they had to run this country of 30 million people. So you can imagine if you are, you know, forming a government and you're Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, and you are looking for someone to become the Minister of Health, and you look around your table, and the person who maybe is prepared to play that role is someone who did O-level biology. And you say, okay, why don't you become Minister of Health? And you're looking around the table for someone to be Minister of Finance, and the best prepared person there is someone who studied economics up to Form 2. And you say, okay, why don't you take over as Minister of Finance? And that is what we found ourselves in as we took over. So it was, we had leaders who had not been prepared to lead. And I think this is one thing that we're trying to address as the African Leadership Academy, is that you can't just get up one day and be thrust on and said, become and lead. You need to be prepared to lead. So how do we think about creating processes that prepare people with the values, with the practice, so that when they become leaders, they're ready? And that's what happens.
Okay, Professor Kakane, just to add to what Fred just said, do you agree with him? We shouldn't lay too much blame to our leaders at independence. They weren't equipped, he says.
I do agree, and adding to that, essentially we do also observe that the leaders are people who need to have tremendous amount of inner control or self-control, and somewhere that particular aspect of it, which has been pointed out indirectly by my colleagues here, essentially that inner control aspect of it, I think in some sense has been missing, and also an example of that is also, I think in various ways and means, we also do tend to observe that diversity in some sense is not celebrated in the nations. I think probably this particular aspect also, as I see, could be a key ingredient in terms of ensuring that.
Okay, now developing a sustainable strategic framework for leadership education, where do we start? Whose responsibility is it? Falashadi, perhaps you could start that for us.
I think the responsibility is that of parents, is that of the school, is that of government, and actually all of us are responsible for building the leaders of the future. But since I work in a school setting, and since I'd taken the words of the keynote speaker, I'd like to be a nowist. I think I'd like to say that schools should, we can start, I'd like to start from schools. I think first of all we have to have a mindset. There's a mindset that these children are young, they can't do anything, and therefore and leadership is a skill, therefore it can be taught, it can be learned, it can be mastered. And so we've got to learn to teach it properly. We've got to get our students learning it, and then we've got to get them to master it. So how do we do that? I think for me, it's just a plethora of things. The curriculum, the teaching methodologies, the mindset, like I said, to believe in these children and say, look, they can do a lot more than what we think they can do. And then we've got to give them the skills, because, okay, you have a mindset, so how do we get them to have the skills? I think we have to look at our curriculum. In Nigeria, we really have to look at our curriculum. Beyond the subjects that we teach, I think the subjects are too many, but that's not a topic for today. I think that we are not infusing leadership into our subjects. I don't think leadership should be a subject. It can be taught as a subject, sure, but I also think it's an experiential thing. It's something that you live. It's something that you experience. And so there should be, the curriculum should deliberately build the skill, deliberately build the experiences that will ensure that every child has a chance to be a leader. Because let's face it, every child has something in him or her. My personal educational philosophy is that there's an A star in every child. And I think my job as a teacher is to try and find that A star. And therefore, and there is an A star in every child when it comes to leading as well. You can be a leader. I mean, if you are a tailor, be the best tailor you can be. If you are a teacher, be the best teacher you can be. So how do we get the attitude, the attributes, and then teach them the skills? So like I said, the curriculum and the teacher training, because our teachers are certainly trained to deliver a highly didactic curriculum, rote learning, little or no digital skills or anything. They're just required to stand in front of the class and lecture. So we've got to, of course, go back to that as well. How do we train our teachers? Who's training our teachers? How do we get them into a mindset where they accept that they should no longer be like the sage on the stage in the classroom, but that they should invite children into the leadership of the teaching and learning process? I think it's a big thing. Prefectship in schools, holding assemblies, having children teach as well, having children be part of school governance and school leadership. It's a whole lot of things that I think we need to do in schools. I think I'll leave the higher levels to people who teach children in higher level schools. But I think if we start from there, can you imagine if a child got into university in Nigeria and he was imbued with the skills and the attitude and the attributes to be a leader? Many things that are happening wouldn't happen. Okay,
let me come in here. I'm curious to know, in your experience, what has been, because you mentioned, use the word mindset, what has been the mindset?
Well, we think children are too young. We think
the mindset of the students themselves, the students towards how they see the world.
Okay, the students themselves, I think, don't believe that much in themselves. Nigerian students don't think they have it in them. They think, everybody keeps saying you're leaders tomorrow. How can you be something tomorrow when you haven't gone through a learning process today? So I think the children too have problems with mindset about the belief in themselves and belief in the system, believe in what do they believe about Nigeria, about their own future. So I think that's why we really need to address mindsets from every perspective.
We have been focusing on the topic, developing a sustainable strategic framework for leadership education. We'll take a break now and return shortly.